Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tufts Faculty Webinar Series. The Tufts University Alumni Association is proud to host this unique series, which provides lifelong learning opportunities for our alumni, parents, and friends around the world. We offer live one-hour webinars throughout the academic year on relevant topics delivered by some of the most dynamic faculty members. For all our attendees, your audio has been turned off to eliminate any disruption from background noise. Additionally, please note that you cannot view the other participants who have logged in. If you would like to ask any questions, please type them into the Q&A box located along the bottom of the Zoom window. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Professor Brian Schaffner, who will be discussing how the Democratic nomination was won.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me for this. I thought, when I signed up to do this back in January, I figured this would be maybe the most important thing everyone would be thinking about when we did this in May. But of course, events have changed. But yes, we did see a kind of a crazy nomination race happen this year. And I think it's worth talking about, sort of going back and talking through how Biden ended up becoming the presumptive nominee and what that means for November. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I think when we're talking about who Democrats decide to select as their nominee in 2020, I think the best thing to start with is to think about what they were thinking about after the 2016 election. Right? And in 2016, of course, Hillary Clinton was sort of a surprising loser to Donald Trump in the Electoral College. And it led Democrats to grapple with a lot of things, which was basically sort of how could this have happened? How could Clinton not have sort of won the election against a candidate who seemed fairly unqualified for office and sort of basically a political novice, and in a race which she seemingly led in the polls throughout. And so, and after 8 years of Obama presidency and Obama having two very successful election campaigns. So what Democrats have been grappling with since 2016 basically comes down to sort of what happened to Obama's voters. So we can think about sort of as a starting point, people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, and then what happened to them in the 2016 election. And I did some work with some colleagues in the New York Times that basically broke this out. Okay, so we used very large surveys and voter file records to determine sort of who from 2012 had voted again in 2016 and who they voted for. So we start with the whole base of Obama voters from 2012. Most, of course, still voted in 2016, and they voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, over 53 million voters who voted for Obama came back to the polls in 2016 and voted for Clinton. But what cost Clinton the election was the other basically 12 or 13 million voters who had voted for Obama in 2012, but actually didn't vote for Clinton in 2016. Okay, and so basically what Democrats have been trying to figure out is how do we get some of those voters back? And when Democrats are thinking about this question, they have to think about two things, which is, do we want to focus on the 6 million or so Obama voters who switched over and voted for Trump in 2016, or do we want to focus more on the 4 to 5 million Obama voters who actually just didn't come out in 2016 at all and didn't vote? And of course, there's also this smaller group of Obama voters who voted third party in 2016. So Democrats have basically been thinking about this since 2016, which is basically the idea behind what should the 2020 strategy be? Should it be one of mobilizing voters who didn't come out in 2016 but would vote Democratic if they did vote? Or should it be trying to persuade some of those Obama-Trump voters to come back to the party in 2020 and vote for the Democratic nominee? And there's a lot to think about when you're deciding these things. First off, one thing you have to think about when you're thinking about whether you want to pursue a mobilization strategy or persuasion strategy is the fact that for every one Trump voter that you persuade to vote Democratic in 2020, it basically has a 2-vote effect on the margin because it reduces his vote share by 1 and adds 1 to your vote share. Whereas mobilizing a new voter doesn't have quite as big an effect because it just adds one vote to your share. We can also think about like who those voters are who didn't turn out in 2016 and actually where they are. So a lot of the voters who didn't turn out in 2016 were actually racial or ethnic minorities, right? So if we look down here, we can see that of the Obama voters who didn't vote in 2016, a large share are African-American, Latino, or some other minority race or ethnicity. So one question is, can you get these voters to the polls? Another question is, do these voters live in the right places to actually matter when it comes to the Electoral College? And so another factor to think that Democrats have to think about is, even if you are able to mobilize a lot of Obama voters who didn't turn out in 2016, are those voters going to help you win states like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania? If you're thinking about just these questions, you also have to think about like what kinds of issue positions do these groups have, and what do they care about? And one of the things that we've noticed from studying the Obama-Trump voters versus the voters who stuck with Clinton versus those who didn't vote at all in 2016 is that a lot of the Obama-Trump voters are actually much more conservative than the Democratic base. So for example, a lot of those who switched their votes and voted for Trump, support the Obamacare repeal. They're against a path to citizenship for immigrants. Although on some other issues like the environment or like minimum wage, they look a bit more like the Democratic base. But notice that those who didn't vote in 2020 or in 2016, who had voted for Obama in 2012, are a lot closer to the Democratic base on most of these issues. Okay, so one thing that Democrats have to think about is basically they'll have to compromise less on their policy issues in order to mobilize voters than they would in order to win back some of the Obama-Trump voters. And you can see this from what happened in 2018. So this is basically breaking out voters on a number of issues in 2018 from three different groups. So this group, the light red here, are people who voted for Obama in 2012, voted for Trump in 2016, and then voted for a Republican House candidate in 2018. And then you have the Democratic base, which is people who voted, Obama, people who voted Obama, Trump, and then Democratic. So these dark blue groups are basically these swing voters, people who voted Obama in 2012, voted Trump in 2016, but then went back and voted Democratic again in 2018. And then the light blue is sort of the Democratic base. So these are people, or actually the people who didn't vote in 2016, but came back and voted in 2018. These light blue sort of circles here are the Democratic base. The basic point here is that the voters that Democrats won back in 2018 are a lot more like the Democratic base on a number of issues. For example, they are in favor of gun control. They are supportive of Medicare for all. They oppose Trump's decision to leave the Paris Climate Agreement. And they generally support DACA. On other issues, they actually tend to be more like Republicans, though. So they actually like the border wall relative to the Democratic base. And they also tend to be a little bit more conservative when it comes to racial issues. So they are less likely to agree that whites have advantages in the US. And they also tend to be sort of a little more anti-feminist. So they tend to agree that feminists are making, or tend to not agree that feminists are making reasonable demands. So this sort of paints an important picture for you, which is that on some sort of issues, and a lot of these issues dealing with gun control, dealing with things like healthcare, dealing with things like the environment, the swing voters, the voters who went Obama, then Trump, then back to the Democratic Party in 2018, look a lot like the Democratic base. On some of the other issues, some of the more sort of what we might call sort of cultural issues or issues of that nature, these voters actually look a little bit more like the Republican base. Okay, and that gives you a sense of sort of what Democrats have to think about if they're deciding that they want to go with a persuasion strategy, trying to win back some of these swing voters, or a mobilization strategy. And it might mean having to sort of emphasize some issues, but ignore others. So one other thing about the 2016 election that is significant and I think has colored the Democratic nomination race is the fact that in 2016, you had basically the two least liked candidates basically ever to run for president since we've been measuring these things. So this chart goes back to basically when we started doing really scientific polling of elections in 1956. And this is showing you the percentage of Americans who rate the party's nominee highly unfavorably in each election season. And you can see that Donald Trump gets the recognition for being the most disliked candidate or party nominee during this period. But Hillary Clinton was right behind him as the second most disliked candidate. And so one thing that I think Democrats have also been thinking about in the 4 years since 2016 is the fact that maybe it didn't help them in 2016 that they elected a candidate who was so polarizing like Clinton was. She was certainly very well liked by a lot of people, but also very disliked by a lot of people, which is certainly comes from having been in the public eye for so many years. So this also is coloring sort of how Democrats were approaching the 2020 nomination campaign. So what does that mean for the Democratic primary, and what did that mean for the Democratic primary this year? So I want to start by taking us back to about this time last year. And about this time last year, of course, you know, we had no primaries yet. There were some candidates running, but it was very early. Most people weren't paying a lot of attention. And me and some colleagues basically did an experiment last summer where we basically just would give people a series of two hypothetical candidates to choose between. And we would ask them, like, which of these two candidates would you prefer to as the nominee for the party? And what we would do is we'd tell them a bunch of information about each of these hypothetical candidates. So we would tell them sort of that the person is male or female, or that they're white or Latino or Black, or we'd give them an age. We'd tell them that they were a party outsider or part of the party establishment. And then we would also tell them what their campaign strategy would be and what their position was on some issues. And then what we wanted to see was sort of what kind of traits people were looking for. And so basically what this chart is showing you is the kinds of things that people cared about during that election. So the line here is sort of at 50-50. That means that people were either, if you're to the left of this line, people means that if a candidate took on that trait, they were less likely to be preferred. And if they're to the right of that line, that means if they took on that trait, they are more likely to be preferred. So one thing to note, for example, is that these are just likely Democratic primary voters. So back last summer, likely Democratic primary voters said that they would prefer a female candidate over a male candidate. They also said that they would prefer a Latino or African-American candidate over a white candidate. Now, this isn't by a large margin, of course, but there is a clear preference there. And I also, as an aside, just point out that they also said that they would really not prefer someone who was in their 70s. And of course, you know, I think you know the punchline, which is that basically you get a male who's white, who's in his 70s, right? So the kinds of things that people said they prefer didn't actually come to fruition at the end of the primary campaign. But one thing we also asked in the survey was not just like, who would you prefer as the party's nominee in 2020, but we also asked which of these candidates do you think has the best chance of beating Trump? Or basically, how likely do you think each candidate would be to beat Trump? And again, the line here basically is just drawn at like the mean value for all candidates. So if you're to the left of the line, that means that if the candidate took on that trait, they were below average in terms of how people rated their chances of being Trump. And if they're to the right of that line, that means they're above average in terms of how people rated their chances of being Trump. And two things I'll just point out here is you see that the gender divide flips when asked about whether you can beat Trump. So likely Democratic primary voters about a year ago said, yes, I would prefer a female nominee, but then they also said, yeah, but I think the male nominee would be more likely to beat Trump. And they said, yes, I'd prefer a Latino or African-American nominee, but actually I think the white nominee is more likely to beat Trump, okay? And so I think you can kind of see what people are struggling with here, what likely Democratic primary voters are struggling with here as they enter the campaign over a year ago, or about a year ago, what they're kind of thinking about, which is like, I have my preferences on one hand about what I think is important, but I also, on the other hand, want to beat Trump. And I want to pick the candidate who's most likely to beat Trump, okay? And I would argue that that's sort of where we end up, and I'll talk through that. So one useful and notable thing about this campaign was that you had basically the largest field of candidates ever, or at least in a long, long time, who were running for the 2020 Democratic nomination. You can see that a little over a year out, you had almost 25 candidates in the race, right? And that way outpaces the Republican field from 2016, which previously had the most candidates in it. And so you had a very big field, okay? So that's one thing that really shaped this election. There were lots and lots of candidates to choose from, which means voters had lots of choices, but it means that they also had to dig through lots of different pieces of information about different candidates, and it might have felt a little overwhelming. And it also meant that having resources, having money, and getting news attention was at a premium, because with so many candidates, it's hard to cut through the noise. And so only the best known candidates, people with high name recognition, with lots of money, who were in the news a lot, would have much of a chance here. Another really important thing to think about before the primary starts is what's the party leadership doing? So in the political science literature, we think about, if we go back decades and decades before the 1970s, it was really mostly up to the party leaders to decide who the presidential nominee would be. Okay, so these are state party chairs or members of Congress who were in the party, or the party leadership would basically sort of choose who would become the nominee. But since we started having a primary-driven process in the 1970s, party leaders can't just decide. But there's this theory that the party still does try to influence who's going to be the nominee. And one of the ways that they do that, or a couple of ways they do that, is as follows. First off, what you get is generally, what you typically have gotten is that a lot of politicians jump in and early on and endorse one of the candidates. And those endorsements are meant to sort of send a signal to primary voters about, this is the candidate that the party kind of prefers. This is the one we think has the best chances, and this is the one we kind of want you to vote for. Those endorsements also send signals to donors about, here's the candidate you should be giving money to, right? And so typically in the past, what you've seen is that this does happen, that a lot of politicians, a lot of party leaders do jump in fairly early and endorse one of the candidates. So you can see, for example, in 2016, that here, that a lot of, and this is just endorsements by governors and members of Congress, but you can see that before Iowa voted in 2016, over 200 members of Congress and governors had already endorsed a candidate in the Democratic primary. One of the notable things that happened in 2016 was that the Democratic Party leaders were pretty much putting themselves on record before Iowa, but Republican Party leaders were much less likely to do so. Part of this is because there was such a big field in 2016 in the Republican primary. Party leaders a lot of party leaders didn't want to upset one candidate by throwing their support behind another candidate. And so party leaders sort of punted the decision on the Republican side in 2016. They basically sort of said, like, well, let's see what happens in the primaries, and then we'll just sort of back whoever wins. We don't really want to take a strong stand. And what you can see happens in 2020 for Democrats looks a lot more like what the Republicans were doing in 2016 than what the Democrats were doing in 2016. So in other words, party leaders in 2020 on the Democratic side were kind of choosing mostly not to pick a candidate at all. They kind of were taking a wait and see approach, which is basically what Republican leaders were doing in 2016. And of course, a lot of people blame the fact that Republican leaders didn't jump in and endorse a candidate early on and coordinate around a candidate early on for why they ended up with Trump at the end of the day, because they never were able to coordinate on a strong alternative to Trump. And so in 2016, most Democratic politicians endorsed a candidate. Most actually endorsed Clinton before Iowa. In 2020, though, Democrats were tracking much like the Republicans had in 2016, basically choosing not to pick. And so at first, it looked like the party wasn't really going to make a decision and sort of influence the nomination. And you can see that, in fact, by January 10th of this year, the number of Democratic endorsements was even smaller than the number of Republican endorsements had been in 2016. And remember, 2016, part of the reason Republicans ended up with Trump is because the party leaders didn't really coordinate on a strong alternative. And so it seemed like Democrats were headed in a similar direction in 2020. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but basically where that leaves us is that what I think happens during the campaign is that we get what I think are three really crucial stages that end up deciding the nomination. And what I'm showing you at the bottom here is just national polling on who people preferred as the nominee during the course of the race, starting in January 2019. And what I'm going to talk about is basically three different moments, three different stages that I think really helped to shape where we ended up. So the first stage that I'll talk about briefly is Warren's surge and then fall in the fall of 2019. And you can see this is Warren's line here. So actually I'll highlight that. Okay. So you might remember, if you go back to September, October of last year, that Warren all of a sudden was surging ahead in the polls during fall of 2019. But you can also see that her support didn't last long. It sort of hit its peak in early October and then quickly declined again. So there was this period during August, September, October when Warren was basically the sort of the primary challenger to Biden's stature as the front runner in the polls, but that quickly dissipated. And by January of this year, she was clearly on the decline, with Sanders having overtaken her as Biden's biggest rival for the nomination. Then the second stage I'll talk about is the moment that Sanders had, which basically, I would argue, starts with Iowa and then lasts through his win in Nevada. And then, of course, we get the third stage, which is basically what I would argue is sort of a conditional party decision, which is basically happens. I would argue the party was basically waiting for Biden to show that he could win something. And then once he showed that he could win something, the party was quick to coordinate to back him. And I would argue that the reason that they do that is because they see him as the best chance to beat Trump at that point. So let's talk about first Warren's surge and then her decline in the fall. So again, Warren starts doing really well in the polls, starting basically in August of 2019. August, September, October, she's rising in the polls, and then basically she quickly, her stature diminishes. And there's a couple of reasons I would argue that this is the case. So the main reason, of course, is that candidates who surge generally then face more scrutiny, right? They get more scrutiny from the press, but they also get more scrutiny from their opponents, right? So, if you watch some of these debates, you can kind of tell who's doing well in the polls because that's who everyone gangs up on at the debates. And that definitely happens to Warren in October when basically she gets attacked for her position on Medicare for All. And particularly, she keeps getting asked how she's going to pay for Medicare for All. Isn't she going to have to raise taxes? And she refuses to say that she would raise taxes for a long time during the debates. And this undermines some of her support because people start to think of her as sort of untrustworthy or as sort of shifty in terms of a candidate. And that's one of the things she runs into. Another big thing I'd argue that she runs into is that at about this time, so sort of late October, mid to late October, the New York Times does this big poll of all the swing states, all the major swing states, and basically tests matchups between Trump versus Biden, Trump versus Sanders, and Trump versus Warren. And the big headline from that poll is basically that Biden matches up well against Trump, but Sanders really doesn't, and Warren especially doesn't. Okay, and you can see that in these polls right here, that in Michigan, Biden has a narrow lead over Trump. In Pennsylvania, narrow lead. Wisconsin, narrow lead. Florida, narrow lead. Arizona, narrow lead. Whereas in 4 of those 5 states, Warren has a deficit relative to Trump. And so right at the time when she's getting scrutinized for her inability to explain how she's going to pay for Medicare for all, she's also then taking some hits in terms of her electability. Basically, these polls are suggesting that she would not fare as well as Biden and perhaps Sanders in a head-to-head matchup with Trump in November. And those 2 things served to undermine her candidacy and produce a drop in the polls. But what I would also mention is that it's not, those factors might have been important, but they didn't necessarily sink the hopes of other candidates. So for example, you know, Bernie Sanders basically overtakes Warren, but he has a lot of the same issues that she does. And so I want to take a little bit of an aside to talk about the fact that in this primary campaign, I noted that we had lots of women candidates running, lots of very qualified women candidates in the race. We had several female US senators running for office, running for the nomination. And yet none of them really caught on. You know, Warren did more than any of the rest of them, but none of them really did very well. And I think one thing we have to recognize and shed some light on when it comes to this is the fact that one of the reasons that women might not have caught on in this primary race is that they still run up against the difficult issue of sexism among voters. Okay, so I've done a lot of research on how voters hold sexist attitudes and how they use those to drive their vote choices. This is what I'm showing you here is basically how the US adult population is distributed on what I call what is called the hostile sexism scale, which is basically a number of statements that people either agree or disagree with that are related to sort of how they view women. So it's generally picks up hostility or prejudice towards women. And you can see that, like, while Democratic voters are generally less sexist than the American population, there still are a lot of sexist Democratic primary voters, and who are at least modestly sexist. And so this is something that female candidates have to work against when they're running for the nomination, is that there are some people who are going to be reluctant to vote for a female candidate. And you can see this here, where we basically broke up the Democratic primary electorate into groups: least sexist, somewhat less sexist, more sexist, and most sexist. And then this was back in June of last summer. Okay, and we basically asked people, just tell us all the candidates you're thinking of voting for right now. And then we just took what percentage of those candidates are women. So among the least sexist group, those voters, about 40% of the candidates they were considering voting for were women. So people like Warren or Klobuchar or Kamala Harris or Kirsten Gillibrand, for example. Among the most sexist voters, though, fewer than 20% of the candidates that they were considering were women. Okay, so they were much less likely to be even considering voting for a woman for the nomination. And then when we looked at the role of sexism, even as late as January of this year, when we asked people, who are you planning to vote for the nomination, we find again that among the people who most disagree with sexist statements, Warren actually did quite well. But as people are less likely to disagree with sexist statements, Warren does increasingly worse. Okay, so a lot of Democratic primary voters are here, but there's still a lot that are here that tend to be ambivalent or even agree with some sexist statements. And among that group of voters, Warren does much, much worse than she does among those who strongly disagree with sexist statements. Whereas Biden and Sanders' support is not strongly affected by sexist attitudes, and if anything, they gain some votes as people's sexism increases. So this was what Warren was up against, right? So there is still sexism in the Democratic primary electorate, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a woman can't win the nomination. Obviously, Clinton did that successfully in 2016, but it does mean that the bar might be higher for what you have to achieve in order to win that nomination. And so I would argue that it's partly a matter of some of the things that came up when Warren was surging that mattered, but I think those things probably mattered more because people are more likely to judge more quickly a female candidate because of underlying sexism in the primary electorate. Okay, so going back to then, by December, early January, basically, Warren is no longer sort of the preeminent competitor for or contender against Biden, and that really becomes Bernie Sanders, right? And so this is the forecast model from 538.com, and you can see this is basically just registering what % chance they think each candidate has of basically going into the convention with a majority of delegates, essentially winning the nomination. You can see the pink line here is Biden, who they think before Iowa is the candidate who's most likely to win the nomination. But notice that even then, his chances are below 50%. The blue line here is Sanders. You have this black line, which is really interesting, which is basically that no one would have a majority of delegates going into the convention, which would mean that you'd have an open convention where basically who knows who would end up winning the nomination. And then you can see the other candidates there. So what I want to point out is we have this month that is really crazy, right? So right before Iowa, Biden's a pretty heavy favorite, and then Iowa happens and Sanders surges to become the favorite. Biden drops below 25% chance. Sometimes he's even below 10% chance. And then for a period as well, it looked like none of these candidates would get a majority of delegates and that we'd have an open contested convention. So what happened? So Sanders, why doesn't Sanders take advantage of his victory in Iowa? And one thing I'll say is that, of course, his victory in Iowa was, well, maybe not even a victory, but at best it sort of came with an asterisk, which is that, well, Pete Buttigieg kind of also won Iowa or won it, depending on which metric you used. And that stole a little bit of Sanders's thunder that he was probably hoping to get out of Iowa. But there are more important issues going on for Sanders, which was always going to make it difficult for him to win the nomination. And one that I'll point out, and this is actually a graph from the 2016 primaries. And this is just a simple graph showing that on the x-axis, the % of Democratic primary voters who were white, and on the y-axis, the % of the Democratic primary vote won by Sanders in that primary. And this is from 2016. And this is basically just all states that had exit polls in 2016. And of course, he does extremely well in his own home state of Vermont, but every other state falls very closely on this line, which shows that basically Sanders does well in states in 2016, in states that have more white primary voters, but he doesn't do very well at all in states that have more African-American primary voters. And this basically speaks to what was his major weakness in 2016 and what was still his major weakness in 2020, which is that Sanders' support is largely comes from white Democratic primary voters, not from minority, racial or ethnic minority primary voters. Now, in 2020, he did a bit better among Latinos than he had done in 2016, but he didn't really do much better among African Americans. And African Americans make up a very large share of the Democratic primary electorate. And so this was one of the things that he was always going to run up against, and he never was able to make inroads with African American Democrats in 2020 to improve on what had been his Achilles heel in 2016. And the other thing that actually becomes evident even early on is that Sanders isn't doing nearly as well in 2020 as he did in 2016 in any of the primaries. So this graph just basically plots how he did in a state in 2016 compared to how he did in 2020. And this red line would, if a state fell right on that red line, it would mean that he had done just as well in that state in 2020 as he had done in 2016. And of course, you know, he would hope to at least be on this line, but ideally be above it. Even though there was a multi-candidate race, of course, you know, if his support in 2016 came from voters who were voting for him, then he would hope to retain those voters in 2020. But there were some pretty clear early signs that this wasn't happening, and I would point out that New Hampshire is one of those. So after Iowa, you get the New Hampshire primary. You know, Bernie Sanders is from next door. He did extremely well there in 2016. As you can see, in 2016, he won about 60% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. But note, in 2020, he doesn't even win 25% of the vote, or he only wins about 25% of the vote. So where did all his support go? And this happens in state after state after state. In every state, he does worse in 2020 than he did in 2016. And which raises the question, where did that support go? And I think the answer is that a lot of his support in 2016 was not really support in favor of Bernie Sanders, but it actually was more of an anti-Clinton vote. That there was a fair share of the Democratic primary electorate who didn't want to nominate Clinton, who didn't really like Clinton, and basically voted for Sanders because he was the candidate who was running against Clinton. And so when he ran again in 2020, you could see that a lot of those voters didn't back him again in 2020 as they did in 2016. And a big reason for that was the reason that they had voted for him in 2016 was not necessarily because they loved him as a candidate, it was more because they didn't like Clinton. And so that's another issue that he ran up against, is that even though he was winning caucuses and primaries early on in this calendar, he wasn't winning with big vote margins. He actually was sort of eking out victories with small shares of the vote. And that kind of showed us that he had this this limitation in terms of how broad his support would be. And of course, after the Iowa caucus, after the South Carolina, the New Hampshire primary, and then Nevada caucuses, you get South Carolina. And South Carolina was always meant to be Joe Biden's firewall. And so you can see his support was fairly consistent in the South Carolina polls. He always basically sort of threw that down as a marker. He kind of like admitted, like, I don't think I'm going to do that well in Iowa. I don't think I'm going to do that well in New Hampshire, but I am going to do well in South Carolina. And even though he took a little bit of a hit in the polls after the Iowa caucuses, he rebounded clearly, and he ended up winning overwhelmingly in South Carolina. And so he had basically done at that point what no other candidate had done yet, which is basically score a blowout victory. And he did that again, largely because African Americans really rallied to Joe Biden, but he also did really well among a group that actually supported Sanders a fair amount in 2016, which is non-college educated whites. And once Biden showed that he could win a state, and keep in mind that Biden had been running for the presidency for 32 years. Like, his first campaign was in 1988, and he had never won a primary. But he finally won a primary 32 years, or partway into his 32nd year of running for president. And then the party quickly basically chose him as their standard bearer. And so you see basically what appears to be a coordinated effort by party leaders to orchestrate the having Buttigieg and Klobuchar drop out before Super Tuesday and endorse Biden, and the idea being that they don't want to divide the anti-Bernie Sanders vote. They want to allow that to coalesce behind the candidate who has the best chance of beating Sanders, and that just absolutely works almost flawlessly on Super Tuesday. Biden wins huge margins in most of the southern states, really blowing out Sanders in a lot of the southern states, especially the ones with high African-American populations. He even wins some surprise victories. For example, winning Massachusetts was quite a surprise. He wins Klobuchar's home state of Minnesota, and Sanders wins a few states, including the big state of California and his home state of Vermont, but even then, he's not winning by enormous margins, and so he's not racking up a lot of delegates. And essentially, after Super Tuesday, the race is more or less over. So you can see that basically here you get South Carolina. By the end of Super Tuesday, Biden's chances of winning the nomination are almost up to 100%. In fact, basically another week later, they're up to essentially 100%. So Biden goes from clear frontrunner to in big trouble to presumptive nominee in just a matter of weeks. It was really quite a turnaround, and it basically came partly because of Biden's strength, especially among African-American voters, but also partly because the party did decide to help him along and coordinate in order to allow the Super Tuesday vote to buoy him to the nomination. So before I end, I want to quickly talk about what this means for November, and specifically, did Democrats make the right choice? So one reason, again, that Democrats or the party wanted to rally behind Biden is because they see him as kind of a candidate who might be able to appeal to these Obama-Trump voters, or at least some of these swing voters in Midwestern states especially. And one thing they look at is the fact that he's not as polarizing a figure as, for example, Hillary Clinton was. And this just shows a flow chart of we interviewed the same group of American adults in October 2016 and then again in March 2020. And you can see that, like, some people who really like Clinton only somewhat like Biden, and some people who really only somewhat like Clinton really like Biden. But where you see the big shift is that a lot of people who really dislike Clinton only somewhat dislike Biden, and some of those actually somewhat like Biden. Okay, so almost 50% of American adults really disliked Clinton in October 2016, and that share of very unfavorable ratings goes down quite a bit for Biden. Okay, at least now. We'll see if that lasts through a general election campaign, but for now at least, Biden is going into the race not quite as polarizing a figure as Clinton was, and that's, I think, one thing that Democrats were looking for. So far in the polls, these look kind of similar. So the top is Trump versus Biden, and the bottom is Trump versus Clinton. These are the national polls at this exact point in time in 2016 compared to now. You can see that the average lead for Clinton at this point in time in 2016 was 3.2 points, and for Biden now it's 4.5 points. So far so good. Democrats have nominated someone who actually has a larger lead over Trump, even though Trump is now the incumbent president. And then one thing that actually I'm not sure was necessarily expected, but it's interesting and potentially very important, is that Biden is improving significantly over how Clinton did, especially among older voters. So some of the early polling is showing that Biden has up to a 10-point lead among voters who are 65 and older, whereas Clinton lost that group by 5 points in 2016. And of course, we know that old voters are the ones who are most likely to turn out and vote anyway. So if you can change those margins, that's a big chunk of the electorate that you're going to be winning over. And of course, what does this mean? Well, we have a lot of the same battlegrounds as we did in 2016. But if you are changing the margin among old voters, that may give you a much better chance, for example, of winning Florida, or of course states like Pennsylvania, which is also one of the older states in the U.S., or Wisconsin. So did Democrats make the right choice? This is sort of my who knows, we'll see answer. Like there's some good early signs, but it's hard to say, you know, how candidate Warren or candidate Sanders would be doing among these groups if they had become the presumptive nominee. But with that, I will open it up for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. So everyone, please, if you have any questions, yeah, feel free to enter them in the Q&A, and I will read them out for Brian to answer. So going through some of the questions we had. So what was the impact of the Bernie supporters in 2016, and how can we leverage them in 2020?
Okay. So, you know, I'm not sure exactly what's meant by impact there. One of the things I did study in 2016 was what Bernie supporters, what people who voted for Bernie in the primary ended up doing in the general election. And basically, we found, I found using our data that of the people who voted for Bernie in a primary in 2016, about 10 to 12% voted for Trump in the general election in the fall. And then several more didn't vote or voted third party. So it ultimately ended up being that about 18% of people who voted for Bernie in the primary in 2016 didn't vote for Clinton in the general election, either because they didn't vote or they voted for Trump. One thing I'll point out, that's not an unusually large number. That's actually about average for what we find across all primaries. So you'll see something similar, for example, in 2008 with people who had voted for Clinton. A lot of them, some of them actually voted for McCain in the general election. And a lot of those people who had voted for Bernie in the primary in 2016 weren't actually very liberal or sort of strong Democrats. They were more sort of people who were still sort of registered Democrats, but were kind of becoming more disconnected from the party. And it looked like most of what they were doing was voting against Clinton. And so when Clinton got the nomination, they decided to back Trump or to not vote. In 2020, that group's going to probably be a little bit less important in some ways. One, because it's a smaller group than it was in 2016. So in 2016, you know, it was like about 45% of Democratic primary voters had voted for Sanders, but this year it will be something like 20%, 15, 20%. So it's a much smaller number to start off with. That group that voted for him this year are people who are more in tune with, or sort of more in line with the party, at least the party's more liberal base. And while you hear a lot of noise on Twitter or on social media about, you know, Bernie voters who won't vote for Biden, you know, overwhelmingly most will. Because, you know, at the end of the day, you make a choice between, do you want to see Trump reelected or maybe a Democrat who you don't agree with on a lot of things, but, you know, at least is not Trump. Most Bernie voters, I would say probably over 85% will certainly vote for Biden in the fall. And so I wouldn't expect that it's going to cost Biden too many votes this time around.
All right. Next question is, why did those somewhat conservative voters who voted for Trump vote for Obama in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So part of what happens is, of course, the parties are always shifting, and you know, it's easy to think about the Democratic Party as mostly the sort of Democratic Party that we recognize, which might be sort of big city liberal Democrats, basically progressive Democrats. But a lot of the party is still more people who live in more rural areas, who have, I wouldn't necessarily call them conservative, but they have a mix of positions. They tend to be conservative on some of the cultural issues. So they're not as progressive on issues related to race or gender relations, but they do like progressive economic policies, like they do support things like Social Security and Medicare and that kind of thing. And so one reason they had voted for Obama in the first place was that Obama did things that they liked, and despite the fact that Obama himself was African American, he didn't actually talk about race issues that much. In fact, he tried to almost never talk about race issues until at least after his reelection, and he mostly tried to avoid them altogether. So he didn't sort of talk about those things up front that much. Instead, what he talked about was helping the auto industry and getting people back to work and giving them health care, and that's the kind of stuff that those Obama-Trump voters actually liked. And what I think that what turned them off, maybe to some extent, or what pulled them in the Republican direction in 2016 was some of Trump's sort of xenophobic rhetoric. I think they responded to. And at the same time, Clinton was also sort of being very, was talking a lot about her progressive views on racial issues and issues related to women, of course, talking about, breaking the glass ceiling. Of course, she herself was a woman. I think some of that actually also pushed them away from the party. So I think the best way to think about those voters is that they have mixed views on these things, and that they do like the bread and butter sort of economic stuff that Democrats offer, but they don't like as much the sort of progressive stuff on race and gender as much.
All right, we have 4 more questions. So the next one is, what role do you think the media played in the Democratic primary with respect to Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden and their electability?
It's a good question. It's always very hard to say what role the media plays, because people, of course, select into watching the shows or following the feeds that they tend to agree with in the first place. And so, it's easy to show that, like, well, people who watched this network, like Joe Biden and didn't like Bernie Sanders, but a lot of that might be simply because that's why people chose the network in the first place. I think Sanders was often probably treated as a candidate who was less likely to win in the fall against Trump. I think some of that is backed up by the polling, but I think the difference between Biden and Sanders might not be quite as great as the media made it out to be, and that may have played a role for sure. I think Democratic primary voters ultimately kind of looked at this and said, Sanders is a bit of a riskier bet than Biden. They felt like Biden might just be a safer bet, that people already know a lot about Biden, so their opinions on Biden aren't going to be changed as easily. That it might be too easy to paint Sanders in a sort of the socialist box that would make him disliked by a lot of Americans. And I don't know how much of that was really a media narrative and how much is actually, in fact, reality.
All right. Do you think there is a correlation between having a long history in the Democratic establishment and securing a nomination? For example, Clinton and Biden?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, it used to be true in both parties. Of course, like, if you go back and, if you think about, the Republican side, even Reagan was sort of an outsider, but he was really just an outsider in 76. By 1980, he had basically almost won the nomination in 76. And so he was kind of seen as like the establishment pick. And then, of course, his VP gets it. And then Bob Dole, who's definitely part of a long-time establishment. So there was this long line of Republican establishment figures getting the nomination. And I think Democrats have largely been the same way. And of course, the big break from that would be 2008, when most of the party establishment lined up to get behind Hillary Clinton, and Obama was able to win the nomination despite having most people having lined up behind Clinton going in, and having and Obama, of course, had a very short career in, relatively short career in Democratic politics as an office holder before he ran for office in 2008. But of course, you can always find exceptions, but I think both parties largely in the past have nominated people who have been around for a long time. And I think part of that is because it does take money to win a nomination. And so the longer you've been around, the easier it is for you to raise money. Name recognition really helps. And of course, getting those endorsements helps. And so the longer you've been around, the easier it is to rack up endorsements. So in some ways, candidates like Trump or Obama are the exceptions rather than the rules.
All right. So state polls were notoriously bad in 2016. Have pollsters corrected those errors, and do you have more confidence in the accuracy of state polls today?
Could do a whole webinar on this. So some state polls are working to fix the issue. I think so one of the big issues in 2016 was that most state polls did not weight on education. And what you've probably read about is that, in 2016, we had the biggest divide in the voting patterns of college whites versus non-college whites that we've ever had in decades. So with non-college whites going overwhelmingly for Trump and college whites going overwhelmingly for Clinton. And it turns out that college whites are also more likely to answer surveys than non-college whites. So non-college whites are harder to get to answer surveys. So a lot of the state polls were bad in 2016 because they didn't have enough non-college whites in their samples. And so they were overestimating Clinton's support because college whites were overwhelming for Clinton, but they were missing those non-college whites who were going to vote for Trump. Some of the state polls have started to fix that. One thing I would recommend is that if you are looking at a state poll, that see if you can find where they say what they're waiting on, and if they're waiting on education, you can feel better about that poll. But I think I've seen a recent analysis by my friend Nate Cohn at New York Times, which showed that still over half of state polls in this cycle don't weight on education, which means that you do have to be a little distrustful of a lot of those state polls.
All right, thank you. And in our last few minutes here, I think our last question, very topical. How is the coronavirus affecting all of this?
It's a great question. So it's really hard to know, of course. The coronavirus is a totally unprecedented event. It's unlike anything that's happened during a presidential election year. And there's two basic sort of political science theories that could come into play here. One is, on one hand, you get sometimes presidents benefit when there's a crisis from what's called a rally around the flag dynamic, which is basically that when there's a crisis, people rally behind the president and support the president because they all want to be supportive of the effort to sort of deal with the crisis. And you see that, the most recently you see that in reaction to 9/11, that George W. Bush's approval ratings, went sky high among even Democrats in the wake of 9/11. So one theory would be like, oh, Trump will benefit from this because people will rally around him in terms of this being a crisis event. But rally around the flag polling sort of boosts don't generally last that long, so it's not clear that that would last. And we haven't really seen that in his approval ratings anyway. We saw a slight tick upward for maybe a few weeks, and then it's ticked back basically to where it has been for most of his presidency. The other factor that might come in here, of course, is the economic factor, which is that presidents do worse when they run for re-election under bad economic conditions, when unemployment is high or when the GDP is dropping, et cetera. We're certainly going to see, we're certainly already seeing, unprecedented unemployment figures. And then the question is, how much is Trump going to be blamed for that? And if Trump is blamed for that, that would obviously really derail his chances of re-election. So if the economic hurt that this crisis brings to people becomes significant enough, a lot of his supporters are likely to abandon him. And so you could see him actually ended up losing in a blowout if the economy does, really start to affect people. And then, the third thing I'd note is that, I showed you the numbers about Biden doing well among those who are 65 and older. And there's some thought that, maybe that some of Trump's older supporters are souring on his reaction to coronavirus because that's the group that's most at risk. And so, if in fact, even if he loses maybe 5 points off his share of the 65 and older vote, that would, we're talking about really thin margins in 2016. So, if you're losing even 5 points from the 65 and older vote, that's enough to cost him the election. So, it could help him. It's more likely to not help him, but it's not clear sort of how big that hit is going to be in November.
Thank you, Brian. We hope you enjoyed our webinar today. As a reminder, for any questions in the Q&A box that were unaddressed, we will share as many answers as possible with you in an email. This presentation has been recorded and will be available soon on our Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. In a moment, you'll be sent a brief survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey, as we do value your feedback, and it will help us enhance future sessions. Thank you again for joining us today.